Hello, my name is Karrah Cheruiyot, and I am honored to be presenting my dissertation, Facing History, a systematic literature review of the intersection of trauma-informed education, critical race theory, and Ubuntu in the K-12 history classroom. So a little bit about me. I am a world history and ethnic studies teacher in St. Paul Public Schools with a passion for equity. And I feel a personal sense of responsibility and accountability towards history and doing it right. Now, I do want to preface that I am a white researcher. I am a white woman, and I recognize that that is a limitation in my research in itself. I also want to acknowledge that, especially when looking at research and literature on race, there is a history of colonial knowledge theft, and that is not what I am trying to do, even though I will be looking into knowledge that is non-Western or considered non-white research methods. But there's a real need for a practical solution to tangible issues in the history classroom. I'm hoping that my research can maybe enlighten some connections that have been missed in the hopes that we can make substantive change. So, in terms of my introduction, I looked at how the history classroom has become this socio-political ground zero, this teaching of majoritarian history, the history that we all knew and learned in school that was incomplete at best or inaccurate at worst, versus non-majoritarian histories that are inclusive of diverse epistemologies. But I also looked at how mental health is a key factor in understanding how people respond to historical understanding. A very large piece that is underrepresented and not talked about is the historical trauma that people of color can experience when learning about history. But instead, we tend to focus on white guilt, which is also a mental health issue and a valid issue to address, especially with children. These are mental health challenges to our historical understanding, and those need to be understood and addressed. And I also talk about how there might be solutions to some of the challenges in the history classroom if we are willing to look at non-white epistemologies, particularly critical race theory and Ubuntu, which is a South African indigenous knowledge ideology. Um, the problem statement really looks at, again, that socio-political ground zero in the history classrooms, classrooms being caught between the political discourse on history education and this teaching of non-revisionist history inclusive of diverse epistemologies versus white guilt, which has in some ways stagnated the way that we examine history and the need for a practical solution. I have three research questions that I looked at. Where do critical race theory and trauma-informed practices intersect in existing literature to inform K-12 history curriculum? Where do Ubuntu and trauma-informed teaching practices intersect in existing literature to inform K-12 history curriculum? And where do Ubuntu and critical race theory converge and diverge from each other in existing literature from around the world? So I looked at knowledge that already existed in my literature review. I started with that mental health framework that we're going to be looking at, the trauma-informed practices. SAMHSA has 6 guiding principles to a trauma-informed approach. They are safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. I also looked at race, trauma, and mental health in the classroom, the social construction of race, and then looked at critical race theory with its 6 tenets and Ubuntu with 3 tenets. The methodology was particularly challenging to determine for this study because as a white researcher, it was going to run into a lot of ethics issues talking about challenges surrounding race. It's really sensitive. It can be very traumatic. And so therefore, the methodology we chose was one that was strategically designed not to involve human participants in order to avoid any potential harm. So instead, we chose a systematic literature review, which the best way to really describe that would be like a literature review to the nth degree. It is a very specific type of literature review with inclusion and exclusion criteria in order to narrow what we are looking for, in which the researcher, I looked at many different, what was it? I believe it was 75 different pieces of literature. 45, I believe, met the criteria. And I looked for answers to those three research questions within the literature. And now the literature was not addressing those questions specifically at all, but it was hidden within the text if you were looking for specific things. And so that was what I was looking for. And I used data analysis procedures to code to the theoretical framework principles. Now, of course, we had to have ethical considerations such as anti-racism and equity as ethics, not as bias, using a critical and decolonized epistemological orientation, and of course, being within city compliance and Belmont alignment. Now, for the results, I did find numerous intersections. These intersections, I'm going to go by each principle within SAMHSA's 6 guiding principles. The first being safety. I found it intersected at 3 of critical race theory's tenets and at 3 of Ubuntu's tenets. The second of trustworthiness and transparency intersected with critical race theory at 4 tenets. It did not technically intersect with Ubuntu. However, it kind of broke my heart in all honesty because I was so close to finding an intersection. I think it's there. I just couldn't quite find enough research within my specific inclusion and exclusion criteria to meet the minimum qualification for an inclusion criteria. But further research, I bet I could find it down the road. The third tenet of peer support intersected with critical race theory at 5 places and at 3 tenets for Ubuntu. Collaboration and mutuality intersected at 3 tenets for critical race theory and in the collectivism tenet for Ubuntu. The 5th principle of empowerment, voice, and choice intersected at 3 tenets for critical race theory and 2 for Ubuntu. And the last principle of cultural, historical, and gender issues intersected with critical race theory at 4 different tenets for critical race theory and 2 for Ubuntu. There were also numerous divergences, as could be expected, between critical race theory and Ubuntu, but there were many, many convergences. Basically, what was found was that there are a lot of ways that critical race theory and Ubuntu can promote healing and trauma-informed practices in the history classroom. There's so much there, but on their own, there are gaps. But if you put critical race theory and Ubuntu together, they can fill those gaps in a way that can teach history ethically inclusive of diverse epistemologies that can potentially promote healing as a society. So, what are those conclusions? I kind of alluded to them just now. One of the key things to note was the concept that healing is not possible if we forget. If we ignore hard histories, we cannot heal. So we need to use those trauma-informed practices, those 6 guiding principles, to validate harms, including historical harms. I propose 5 steps to a trauma-informed history education. First, building a safe classroom community, to commit to teaching non-revisionist and inclusive history, to address white guilt, historical trauma, and to work towards historical healing in the classroom. All of these are based on what was found and detailed in the dissertation through critical race theory and Ubuntu in collaboration with each other. And I'd like to close with just one particularly salient quote that I'm very fond of by Desmond Tutu, Archbishop in South Africa who worked with Nelson Mandela to end the apartheid. And he is one of the biggest advocates of Ubuntu. As he said, forgiving and being reconciled are not about pretending that things are other than they are. It is not patting one another on the back and turning a blind eye to the wrong. True reconciliation exposes the awfulness, the abuse, the pain, the degradation, the truth. It could even sometimes make things worse. It is a risky undertaking, but in the end, it is worthwhile because in the end, dealing with the real solution helps to bring real healing. Thank you so much for your time. It has been wonderful speaking with you, and I hope you found this enlightening.